Hello and welcome to Insight. Join us as we come to you with a whole new, fresh season of bright new episodes with some of the brightest minds in the country. Today, I have with me Ambassador Pankaj Saran. Ambassador Saran was formerly the Indian ambassador to Russia. He also held the very distinguished position of being the Deputy National Security Advisor to the Government of India until 2021. Presently, he is a member of the National Security Advisory Board. Mr. Saran and me today will discuss India's foreign policy and its trajectory. Sir Ambassador Saran, it is such a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. But I know we have limited time with this interview, so I'm going to go straight right into it. You have held such important positions. You know, you've been the Deputy NSA till 2021. You have seen world orders change, so as to say. So, how would you see the present emerging global order in terms of, in reference to the geopolitical strategy that is playing out? How important do you think it is to countries like ours?
Yeah, firstly, Rami, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you on your show. So thanks for inviting
You're
me.
welcome, sir.
Well, this is a big question that you've asked, and actually, it is something which is the substance and the essence of how India is trying to navigate its way through. Obviously, the world has changed since 1945, since the establishment of the United Nations and the end of the Cold War. And we've had so many historical milestones. But the fact is, you've seen the rise of China, you've seen the end of the Cold War, you've seen the unipolar movement of the 90s when the United States was the preeminent power. And then you are now seeing a revival of the East West conflict and confrontation. And in the middle of all this, you're also seeing the rise of other powers, and that includes India. So while we were faced with all this uncertainty and conflicts and contestations, earlier it was ideological, today it is of another kind. What has happened in the middle of all this is that India has been rising at some stages slowly, but in the last 10 years more rapidly. And so it is hitting against the established order that was actually created by the victors of the World War. So when India talks about a reform of international institutions, it is not just for the sake of asking for reform. It is born out of a very fundamental proposition that the international institutions created at that time have not been able to keep pace with the changing reality on the ground.
Quite right.
And that is the reason why, since you cannot stop the rise of nations, you have to reform the institutions that are meant to govern their behavior with each other and amongst each other. So I would say that's really the fundamental picture.
So when you say this, we also then what comes to mind is the multipolarity of the world now, you know, dispersed power centers. How do you see India engaging with them? Because everybody seems to want to engage with India today. And like you rightly said, in the last 10 years, there's been some shift. So again, let me ask you a two-part question. The first is, what is this shift? Second, what is the shift in light of, you know, we still seem to be having a policy of non-alignment, you know? So in light of that, do you think it's held us in good stead? And how do we then engage with big powers like the US, Europe, Russia, China?
Yeah, so I think the main change is that all of them are looking at India differently today. They're not looking at the way they looked at us in the 1960s or 70s or 80s, or simply as a post-colonial power.
Yeah.
Today, they're looking at you as someone who stands on its own feet. And that automatically is generating respect for what India does, what India thinks, what India feels about global issues. So I would say you are right. We are in a position today where all sides and all major powers would like to have India on their side. By their side, I mean not just in terms of being in an alliance relationship, but also being in symphony with these powers in terms of how they view the world. So, for example, the United States and the so called collective West would obviously like India to be one among them because of our common values of democracy, pluralism, diversity, etc. The Russians have their own worldview against the West and a different concept of multipolarity. And the Russians would like India also to be thinking on those lines and similar to them. The Chinese talk about this great Asian century and the two great Asian giants which must work together. They just celebrated the anniversary of the Panchshil, etc. So all of them, in their own ways and in their contestations with each other, would like to have India by their side, not on the other side. So this is obviously an advantage from a tactical point of view because then India can leverage its goodwill with each of them and maximize its own gains and advantages. That ultimately has to be the true test of your foreign policy. That it's not so much who you align with, it is about how you can maximize your national interest. So you have both tactical ways to do it and you have strategic long-term ways to do it. So we have to keep a distinction between the two. I don't think we are in a phase of non-alignment at all. I think that concept is more or less dead. Whether it's the G77 or the Third World, which was a highly pejorative term,
Correct.
or the non-aligned movement, I think those are gone. And what we have to understand and we have to tell the major powers is that just as these concepts have gone and they are defunct, we believe that the Cold War mentality is also defunct. So don't put the world through one more phase of Cold War conflict because that completely destroyed the developing countries in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. What we are today talking about, in fact, I would say that the emergence of the global south actually owes itself to the Ukraine conflict. And it was India, among all other nations, which showed the political, I would say, maturity and the wisdom to detect that there was resentment among the vast majority of the countries about what was happening in Ukraine. So the voice of the Global South Summit, the two of them, what was the essence of it? The essence was, you're fighting a war in Europe, thank you very much. But we have serious issues out here of poverty, of development, of unemployment, of welfare, of equity, of health. Who's going to address all these issues? Because if you want us, as the rest of the world, to be obsessed and preoccupied with your conflict,
Correct.
then it's not going to happen again. We've lived through it for 30, 40 years in the Cold War when our issues were neglected, but we don't want to do it today anymore.
When we talk about the global south, as you correctly said, that India showed so much of maturity without being condescending or wanting to be the leader, so as to say. Would this also then work with Latin American countries?
I think so. I mean, I think the outreach to the Latin American continent, the countries in the last 10 years has been more than before. Because remember, there are many issues we share with them. Human rights is something. They're really they have very strong views on human rights. Of course, in their internal politics is something else because they've had a lot of churning, dictatorships, and they don't have much to speak of in terms of the democracy record. But when it comes to, let's say, supply chains, mineral resources, precious metals, lithium, those are things which we need from Latin America. So yes, Latin America has become more important than in the past. There are many countries. We need them. But I would say it is still not, obviously for geographical reasons, in the forefront of our priorities because, geography also matters.
Absolutely. But let me take another question from what you said earlier on, when you said that India, this is not so much about non-alignment, but, India has to put itself first. What happens to China? How do we deal with China? Is it still an intractable force, or is there any potential of any feasibility of compromise between the two countries? And, when they talk about Asia in the 21st century. Do you see this as a possibility?
Look, the rise of China is a fact of life. Everyone has to accept it. Why it has happened, what has been the contributing factors is another story. But the fact of the matter is that China has risen and is rising. We have to deal with it. We have a major power on our borders, on our doorstep. We have to find a way in which to deal with China. You would recall that when Prime Minister Modi became Prime Minister 10 years ago, since then he has held multiple meetings with the Chinese president,
Yes.
both bilateral, on the sidelines, in other capitals. We've had numerous exchanges. Our trade and economic relationship has grown in the last 10 years. So, what is it about the relationship that is troublesome? I mean, two large countries today, we are larger than China in terms of population. So, we are the largest country in the globe in terms of population. They have a civilization, we have a civilization. We are both part of Asia. So, the problem has to do a lot with the way the Chinese approach the world. For them, the Asian century means the Chinese century. The Asian century for us does not mean the Chinese century.
Right.
For them, they want a multipolar world order. We say the first step towards a multipolar world order begins in Asia, where you have a multipolar Asia.
Quite right.
You have to give due respect to all Asian countries, not least India. So, obviously, because of the long border, we have problems, we have differences. The question is, how do you manage? And of course, in the ideal situation, how do you resolve the border and how do you finalize the border? The whole compact with China after 1988 and subsequently was that, look, we will maintain peace and tranquility on the border. We will maintain status quo till such time as we can resolve the border question. What China has done in the last few years, for different reasons, is that they have challenged this basic compact between India and China. And that has proved disruptive. So 2020, and I say that to the Chinese counterparts, is the year when China practically lost India for many years in terms of public opinion. And it was a strategic mistake. So, I was saying that in 2020, when they mobilized hundreds and thousands of troops and moved a large number of air assets, I mean, the whole thing, air assets, artillery, radars, everything, what were you thinking? I mean, why did you do that? So, I would say that the militarization of Chinese foreign policy, their aggression, not just vis-a-vis India on the Tibetan plateau, but even in the maritime borders of South China Sea, Southeast China Sea, etc., has created fear and concern among its neighbors. So when you say that what is the future of India-China, I would say the future is actually good. It's in our hands. But the question is that the Chinese also have to translate their good words into action on the ground. We cannot have a kind of a dual track approach that you say the best things that you can say, but your actions are very different. You have to, make sure that you get India on board in any project that you have to improve the relationship. And I also feel that maybe things are changing now, but there was a certain Chinese attitude towards India which was not exactly complimentary to India. So they need to actually go back to their books and begin to look at India differently.
What was that attitude?
I think some people told me it was pure racism. I mean, it was just simple as that. Even today, if you were to ask a lot of people, they would look at India as a land of snake charmers, elephants. They have this view that India is beset with too many problems, it can never rise, you know. And the other, of course, more recent narrative is that we are too much hooked onto the US bandwagon and we have lost our independent agency to function as an independent country. So both premises are inaccurate and self-defeating. So a lot of the improvement in the relationship, which I believe is possible, depends on fixing themselves.
But would you say that their expertise on India is far more than the kind of expertise that India has on them? For example, scholarship. I find that a lot of the Chinese scholars speak Hindi fluently. Therefore, the kind of access that they have to resources, literature, media.
Yeah, see, one of the aspects of a rising power is that power you have to recognize is not only hard power, it is also soft power. So if you look at the number of young Chinese who studied in American universities and British universities,
Phenomenal.
Fluent English speakers who come back with the same swagger
Yeah.
of those universities. So they're doing it across the board, raising their expertise on countries that matter. You really need to know your neighbor much better than anyone else.
Absolutely. I think that's so important. But let me ask you then, after everything that you've said about, it's uncertain how the road ahead is for India and China, where does that leave us with RCEP? Because there's been, Eastern powers and Western powers that have engaged with RCEP. Is there any chance of India reconsidering its
I
position?
don't see an early chance. I don't see an early chance, and that's a political decision taken by the government, overruling a lot of the classical economists and trade specialists, etc. And I know why the government has taken this decision. And the fact of the matter is that in the last 10, 20 years, the domination of China over the Indian economy is becoming problematic. Number one. Number two, manufacturing as a percentage of your GDP has remained stuck at 16% for the last 30 years. Now, no one is advocating an autarkic or an isolationist policy, but everyone is advocating that you have to do something drastic to enhance manufacturing. Yeah. And you need some more time, because if you open it up, we are not a Korea or a Japan. We are not an ASEAN, small country which can pursue a trade-led growth or an export-led growth. So I would say that the RCEP question will be pushed back a little bit till such time as we put our own house in order. We need more time to settle our own house, the states, the local problems of investors, make it easier, increase manufacturing, production, infrastructure, and then we will see. In any case, our trade is growing. I mean, we are entering into other trade agreements with other parts of the world.
So it's a question of time and how the road ahead.
I think it's a question of time. I don't think no one is questioning the philosophy of the benefits of international trade. Yeah. Or getting into supply chains. But it's just a question of political judgment and political timing.
So talking about political judgment, there are a lot of political analysts in India itself that advocate for stronger relationships with the US being our primary ally. What is your view on that?
When we ask a question, the answer to that, in my opinion, is what works for you. If today a closer relationship with the United States works for you, go ahead. But there was a time, as you know, we did not have good ties with the US. In fact, we had pretty bad ties with the US. And that was for many reasons. And in fact, they actually had chosen, in a sense, if one can use that word, Pakistan over India as their preferred partner in the region. Yes. Today, things have changed. So I would say, yes, go for it. I mean, if the relationship with the United States helps you to achieve your national development goals, please, by all means. But remember always, whether it's the United States or Europe or any other power, all relationships in this business come with a reality check. Everyone wants something out of the relationship. There is no unilateral benefit. Yes. So the United States will also expect some benefits from the relationship, and they will have some expectations. So I would say that the biggest challenge in the India-US relationship is the challenge of expectations. How to manage each other's expectations about each other. Quite right. But like you again reiterated, that it's so important for India to keep what benefits itself first over and above everything else. So therefore, I would consider India no longer being reactive, but being proactive. Now, if it is proactive like that, then let's say in situations like we've just seen the, Israel-Hamas war, we've seen the Russia-Ukraine war, and you were ambassador to Russia as well. So you have
probably, a great insight to this question is, do you think we could have played mediator? We could have been more proactive.
Yeah, so I wouldn't equate necessarily proactiveness with mediation, but I would say proactive in a different sense that you either you predict or forecast problem areas in the world and prepare for them,
Correct.
or you proactively go and cultivate relations, you make friends, neutralize enemies, you don't remain a passive bystander. So I would interpret proactiveness from that point of view. When it comes to mediation, it's a different ball game. In both these conflicts, Ukraine and Gaza, we have to understand there is a long history, highly complex conflicts, not easy to mediate. A lot of countries have tried and failed. But what we have done is that in both conflicts, we have maintained channels with all sides
Yes.
to the conflict. And as we discussed earlier, all sides to the conflict actually are comfortable dealing with India.
Yes.
So I wouldn't get into a formal mediation role, but yes, to the extent that I can talk to Russia, I can talk to Ukraine, I can talk to, let's say, Brussels, I can talk to Washington and London, I'm good.
Fair enough.
And if they are ready to talk to me,
why not?
So, and similarly in the Middle East or West Asia.
West Asia.
So that's how I would look at it. Also just a bit on the whole business of mediation or peacemaking. All these require the right moment. They either parties to the conflict have to be exhausted, or one side has to be vanquished, or there has to be some give in the standoff, which propels them into accepting a mediator.
Fair enough.
I don't see that happening in either of the two
yet. How do you see Prime Minister Modi's visit? It's after 5 long years, I believe, to Russia. How do you see that as a development?
I think it's good. I think there was an interruption in high-level contact, physical contacts. So the visit was going to help to overcome a little bit of that interruption in the last 2 years. Of course, they've been in touch on telephone and so on. I think it's a good visit. I think it's a good move by both sides to resume the system of summits. We have an agreement to have annual summits. This got dislocated. The question is what is going to emerge from the visit. I think one of the main outcomes is going to be to signal to each other that we are still invested politically in the relationship, to signal to the rest of the world that the relationship matters both for Russia and for India. I don't think India is viewing this relationship as being against any third party. When it comes to the Ukraine conflict, we've been in touch with all sides, including Ukraine. We have spoken loudly in favor of dialogue and diplomacy. We've told the Russians this is not an era of war. So we've done all that. From my perspective, if we can reconfigure the relationship with Russia to move it away from defense and military to economic, technology, culture, people to people, the Russian Far East, the Arctic, these are the areas of potential. Remember, Russia is the largest country on the planet. It is 7 times the size of India. There's one province, just one province in Russia, in the Far East, called Sakha, Yakutia, and I've been there, which is the size of India. Wow. And its population is 1 million. And that's the home of the diamonds. And so you're talking of a giant which is straddling, from Western Europe to Vladivostok, 11 time zones. But I don't think there's any country in the world which will seriously believe that you can ignore or write off Russia as a country. So, and we need Russia for many other purposes also.
So, Ambassador Saran, while talking about all these conflicts, I read your articles. You are a prolific writer. You have an insider's view on a lot of these things. So when you talk about war of narratives, it's very interesting because we see this word being flung around. We don't really know, I think, strategically what it means, the kind of impact that it has. Could you shed some light on that?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. This is one of my favorite hobby horses. This whole importance of vocabulary and lexicon
Correct.
in the world of diplomacy, and how India has to have its own lexicon and own vocabulary when we are talking of events. I keep telling a lot of the young researchers, just don't take what you read without filtration into your system.
Absolutely.
I mean, remember, Ukraine, let's talk about Ukraine. Is it a invasion? Is it a conflict? Is it a war? So
Absolutely.
each of these words have been used, but by different players. So it depends on your perspective. So, for example, we saw so much put out, especially on the Ukraine war. So it's a universe by itself. Similarly, on the Gaza conflict, is it a genocide? Is it terrorism? Is it occupation? Is it a freedom struggle? These are all issues. Who's winning? Who's losing? Uh, then, this whole concept of hybrid wars,
Yes.
the idea that you can win a war without actually fighting a war, how you can hit the morale of your enemy, how you can paint a certain event or a personality in a certain way. For example, even in our case, you have sections in the Western media which are painting India in a certain way.
Yeah.
And if you say the same thing 100 times,
People start
then
believing
people
it.
start believing you. So, narratives is really today as important as hard power.
Absolutely, sir. I come from a background on anthropology, and this is exactly what I tell a lot of my young researchers is a lot of the words or definitions that we have today are from a colonial lens, and we keep reapplying it. It's almost like we're using an outsider's lens to look at ourselves.
No, look, imagine we lived for decades with the nomenclature of being the third world.
Third world.
So, who was the first and the second?
And who decided
And who
that?
decided that you were actually the third world? So, some
Absolutely.
of it, when you look back, this is another very common phrase used everywhere, especially in the West, the international community. The international community is just a community of 25 countries
Yeah,
or 30
yeah,
countries.
does
So
not represent an entire.
now, when you propagate the notion of the global south,
Yeah.
the global north does not like it because they see it as a trade union bloc. So, anyway, this is an unending enterprise, but it is something which we all, I think, have a responsibility to develop our own Indian way of looking at the world and also being alert to what you're being fed. If you look at, say, Crimea, was it an annexation or was it a referendum
Absolutely.
or was it, the Crimea joining Russia? So every word is
Has a lot
loaded,
of meaning.
and we have to be, conscious of that.
Ambassador Saran, where do you see both of these conflicts ending? How far can this be taken?
Look, insofar as Ukraine is concerned, I think it looks that on the military battlefield, we are going to continue to see these localized battles. Um, I There was a so-called peace summit in Switzerland. I don't think it achieved anything. Um, in my opinion, it's just going to go on, and it's heading towards more and more of a frozen conflict, of a Korea type of situation, or maybe even a Kashmir type of situation, where you have an unsettled line which separates two parts or two countries. So that's where it is right now heading. The only thing is whether it escalates beyond the current, which I do not think it will. I do not think NATO is going to get into it. Also, I think in the next 6 months or 8 months, once the US elections are over, we will know who's in the White House. That is going to play a huge role in the direction in which the conflict goes. Insofar as Gaza, Israel is concerned, again, I believe that a two-state solution is politically correct. We stand for it, but I don't think it's practical for many reasons. It's a tragic situation where you have the rights of the Palestinians, which have been deprived for decades. And on the other hand, you have Israel, which is, a victim of terrorism from extremist groups like the Hamas, etc. So again, not a very optimistic scenario. Again, focus has to be on management, de-escalation, and trying to live as well as you can in a peaceful way with each other. So that's how I would see it.
I'll come to my last two questions, sir, because I think this is something that a lot of our audience would be interested in knowing more about. One is that the Indian diaspora is formidable across the world. What is our leverage? How does India leverage its diaspora?
Of course, look, $130 billion of remittances
Huge.
is, I think, the figure, is the amount we're getting. We are number one in the world,
Yeah.
way above China and Mexico.
Yeah.
So obviously the diaspora is very, very important for our economic needs. Over time, we have the second, third, and fourth generations coming up. People who've never been to India, but who are really rooted in their Indian culture. They keep Indian names, etc., and they have their recollection. And they are coming more and more into the mainstream of society, whether it's politics or economics or business or academia. So all this is very, very good. Does it translate into every member of the diaspora being pro-government in India or pro-Indian? I don't think so. They have their own agency, they have their own mind. But what we are seeing is that there is an association with an Indian name and success. And so you have this wide number of people who are highly ambitious, well-educated, doing well economically, at the upper sections of the social ladder and economic ladder. So all that is very, very good, I would say. And if we can, as much as possible, get some of them back to rebuild and to build our own country, I think that would be the best. We attract that talent pool, bring them back, provide them the right atmosphere and incentives so that they participate in our own growth. I think that'll be very nice.
That makes sense. My final question to you: in the next 5 years under Prime Minister Modi-led government, what do you see as their priority points for its foreign policy? But more importantly, what do you think are going to be the threats to it?
So in terms of priority, I think, look, what we have seen so far in the last 10 years is that it is a very focused kind of policy which is closely related to your domestic agenda of transformation. The Chinese call it the Chinese rejuvenation. We don't use that word, but we are also rejuvenating ourselves. We are transforming at a breakneck speed, and we have no choice given the kind of problems that we have. So I would say it will be a continuation of the same, where foreign policy will be anchored completely in how you can enhance domestic power. Whether it is technology, whether it is markets for your exports, whether it is attracting FDI, whether it is getting into supply chains, all of that is going to drive, the foreign policy. So if you're going with the United States, you know why you're going.
Yes.
If you're going with, for example, Russia, you know why you're going. It's for natural resources. It's for the oil and the gas. So, that kind of thing. In terms of threats, I would say, see, the last 5 years have shown we've lived through so many unforeseen events. The pandemic, the 2020 Chinese mobilization, Ukraine, Gaza, none of these was imminent. So you have to be prepared for unforeseen events, and we can't really define them. We know the conflict areas and hotspots in the world. But apart from that, I'm worried about the nature of the East-West confrontation. It is not looking good. We are running the risk of dividing the world again. And this attitude of you are either with us or against us is not a happy situation. Secondly, global governance is weakening rapidly. In fact, one would say we are heading towards more chaos. because the United Nations is proved to be completely useless
Yes.
in managing or solving anything. And then, of course, you have, we want to see which way China goes. So these are all the threats. Remember, I didn't use the word terrorism, but that's a latent threat which can always arise if Pakistan were to choose to reactivate that button. So far, it hasn't done it, but that always exists.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Saran. There's so much more to talk about, and I really hope that you come back on and have another chat with us.
Thank you.
You know, this conversation is not complete as yet, but thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you so much.